So welcome everyone to our webinar, Is the Site Watertight? Today we are joined by Jonathan Morley and Francesca Caggiano from RPS. Jonathan is a hydrology technical director and an experienced flood risk assessor specialising in the provision of flood risk assessments and drainage strategies. Francesca is a flood risk and drainage consultant with over 6 years' experience in the field of hydrology. Today's webinar will help you understand how sites interact with water, including how to ensure a development will be safe from flooding, the need to improve water quality in the wider environment, and how water is a cornerstone for healthy ecological habitats. As always, there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end of the presentation, so please submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen any point during the presentation, and I will ask these on your behalf. Thank you everyone for logging in, and I'll now hand over to Jonathan.
Derek, thank you very much for the introduction. So the presentation is going to be structured where we will initially look through how we would define a flood risk assessment and when it's required, how then we apply climate change, following that the mitigation measures and requirements, flood resilience and resistance measures. At that point, I will pass over to my colleague Francesca, who will run through some sustainable drainage systems, as well as nutrient neutrality. So, flood risk assessments. Flood risk assessments, following a number of extreme flood events, the scrutiny placed upon plan applications has significantly increased over the last couple of years. This has been reflected in a strengthening of the national and local planning policies through the NPPF and local regional legal policies, as well as in-depth scrutiny on plan application submissions, with FRAs requested for smaller developments on land identified at flood risk from any source of flooding, that be fluvial, tidal, surface water risk, reservoir risk, and also groundwater risk. This can sometimes come as a shock to the applicant, especially for very small applications, leading to unforeseen additional costs. We as a company have been involved with, as I say, some very small applications whereby flood risk assessments have actually been specifically requested by the local authority for developments such as small sheds or paved and hard standing areas for car parking. The updated climate change allowances have also impacted on available land for development, as this has led to a greater attenuation storage volume requirement, as well as greater levels of flood resilience and resistance measures to be incorporated within designs. So throughout the presentation, we will look to cover some of the common reasons for objections we've come across, but feel free to email any sort of specific queries or questions following the presentation, and we'll do our best to get back to you as soon as we can. So, when is a flood risk assessment needed? Any site in flood zone 2 or 3, regardless of the presence of flood defences, as well as size, a flood risk assessment is required. Also, for any sites which are greater than 1 hectare or greater in flood zone 1. In addition, some sites located in critical drainage areas, as well as sites located within areas of surface water risk, groundwater risk, may be requested to undertake a flood risk assessment. Also, where a strategic flood risk assessment, usually undertaken by the local authority, identifies that there's an increase in flood risk from the future, whereby the local authority may have undertaken bespoke modelling, which has included latest climate change allowances or historical climate change allowances, which has identified a greater risk of flooding posed to development site locations. Furthermore, there may be a requirement to undertake a flood risk assessment where there's been a change of use from a less vulnerable development to a more vulnerable category of development, such as residential dwellings with a basement. What must a development show from a flood risk perspective? So the aim of the flood risk assessment is to demonstrate that there is no increase in flood risk on the site or from the site, as well as that access is available, safe access and egress is available at all times, especially in the event of emergency. Show that the development is safe and appropriate resilience and resistance measures have been incorporated into the design, that the flood risk from future events, whereby including climate change, has also been assessed. There are also varying policies throughout the UK. There's the MPPF in England. However, there is also TAN 15 in Wales, which is the underlying guidance for flood risk in Wales. The TAN 15 at the moment is being updated. This update has sort of been continuously in the pipeline for the last couple of years. It was due for implementation in June this year. However, following large numbers of consultation responses, this has been further suspended till the beginning of 2024. In addition to the updates to TAN 15, the Welsh Government also released new guidance for the implementation of SuDS, sustainable drainage, through a new policy, as well as the adoption of the SABs, which have a more detailed review status on drainage applications in Wales. There is also altering guidance in Scotland. This is provided by SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and they have various policy and guidance papers for which an FRA should be undertaken. The main guidance being the Scottish Planning Policy, as well as the Planning Background Papers. They also have the Climate Change Allowances for Flood Risk Assessment Inland. That was recently updated in March 2022. It's also worth noting that the categories for flood risk in Scotland do vary from England and Wales, and you should be cautious of that if you are undertaking any flood risk assessments in Scotland. So, on applying climate change, I will just open it to the floor now to see if there are any questions on the first part of the presentation.
Not yet, Jonathan, but we encourage everyone to just post their questions throughout the presentation, and we'll be answering when some questions come in. I will let you know.
Thank you, Francesca. So, climate change. How do we assess future flood risk? On this slide, we look specifically at fluvial flood risk. So, the climate change allowance is dependent on the location, the flood zone for which the site is either located in or adjacent to, and the type of development for which the application is being progressed. Important aspects of it are there are various climate change allowances for fluvial, tidal, and rainfall data. The climate change allowances supplied by the Environment Agency are updated on a reasonably frequent basis, and the last update was undertaken in May 2022, whereby the data looked to incorporate evidence and statistical information provided by the UK Climate Projection Project 2018. This update focused on sea level rise and alterations to rainfall intensity for various catchments. So in the table on the right-hand side, we can see a sort of example of how the climate change is reviewed. So for here, we've taken a local catchment, the Adur and Ouse catchment, for which we've looked at less vulnerable developments located in floodstone 2 and 3A. So less vulnerable be typically commercial. They would need to look at an 18% increase in fluvial flood risk for up to the year 2050. Any developments can go beyond the year 2080 to look at a 37% climate change increase. When we move to a higher vulnerability classification for residential in flood zone 2 and 3A again, we would look at a 37% increase for 2080 with a view that residential developments are assumed to have a 100-year operational life. When we move to the essential infrastructure, so that's potentially nationally significant infrastructure projects in the same flood zones 2 and 3A, we are directed to look at the higher and central ends of the climate change with a 28% for up to 2050 and then a 55% up to 2080 and beyond. So now we look at how we could look to apply the climate change allowances to the information we may have put readily available. So initially would be a basic assessment whereby we apply a millimeter increase. This would be based on readily available information, or alternatively, we may look at the surface water, EA surface water mapping for a high risk event, or alternatively, we may look at flood zone 2, the extent of flood zone 2, to establish, with that dictated a 1 in 1,000 year event, as a proxy for the 1 in 100 year design event plus an allowance for climate change. If that isn't sufficient, we may move to an intermediate statistical approach, whereby we may have some existing model data available, which may be for a 1 in 100 year event, and then we may have some data for a 1 in 100 year event plus a specified climate change allowance. We may then use a statistical approach to establish the difference in levels, in flood level between the 1 in 100 year and the event plus climate change, and then scale that up or scale it down dependent on the specific allowance for climate change we are looking to establish. If that is still not appropriate, then the final stage is to undertake a bespoke hydrological model, where we may either obtain hydrological model data available in existence from the EA and update that to account for the most appropriate allowance of climate change at the time of production, or alternatively, prepare our own bespoke hydraulic model, including all the climate change allowances, topographical data, in-channel structures, etc. How are the EA's climate change allowances applied? So, where all developments and access routes should be in flood zone 1, there's no need to apply for the climate change allowances. We also need to make sure that the development is in flood zone 1. However, if your development is in very close proximity to a flood extent, there may be a requirement for you to at least assess the potential risk that your site may be impacted by flooding during a climate change event. If your site is a reasonable distance from a flood extent, then you may not, or you will probably not have to undertake that assessment. It is worthwhile, when you're initially undertaking a due diligence of a site, undertaking that review to establish whether your site is in close proximity to a flood zone, or alternatively is actually located within one. There are, as I mentioned previously, there are other forms of flood risk. There's tidal flood risk as well as surface water flood risk. With regards to tidal flood risk, we look to obtain the Environment Agency's extreme tidal model data, to which we would then apply an increase in millimeters dependent on the operational life of the developments. The EA has provided various levels of climate change increase associated with various what's termed epochs or points in time for which the development's life would be operational. With regards to surface water risk, the one way of establishing the impact from surface water risk is either reviewing the EA's online surface water risk mapping, or alternatively, if there has been significant alterations to the urban areas since that modelling was undertaken, it may be more prudent to undertake a bespoke surface water model, whereby the local topography is obtained via LiDAR, a digital surface model. That is then incorporated into a two-dimensional hydraulic model, within which we apply the appropriate rainfall data. From that, we would then be able to establish the surface water flood depths, as well as velocities and directions of flow.
Thank you, Johnny. Before we go into the mitigation requirements, there's a couple of questions.
Yep.
The first one is from Christopher. He's asking, what about coastal erosion, which is linked to sea level rises?
Yeah, the coastal erosion can be undertaken in a tidal model. But however, it is more specific. It's not really accounted for in detail. It would have to be a specific point of requirement via the EA to take that into account, and it would be dependent on your development whether that would be critical to the assessment for which the application is being progressed. I think if it's a more detailed question from Christopher, then I'd be happy to take it separately.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have another question from Christy. You mentioned one of the criteria assessed for flood risk is no flood risk on site or off site, but isn't that a given with any proposed site due to increased surface water? Concrete surfaces will always be more of a risk due to the runoff than a field or surface water absorbed water. How is this risk measured?
Right. So I feel so. What the guidance looks to do is ensure that as a consequence of your development, you are not adversely affecting flooding elsewhere. So in essence, you don't construct a building which then passes on or diverts the flood risk to a neighbouring property, whereby the neighbouring property may not have been at flood risk previously. Once you construct your development, that neighbour is then flooded. So the view of the policy is to ensure that your development, as I say, has no adverse impacts. With regards to hardstand, that should be appropriately addressed within a supporting drainage strategy, whereby the drainage strategy will look to mimic the existing scenario. Most developers, I know that my colleague Francesca will discuss this in a later section. However, you would look to ensure that there is sufficient attenuation for the 1 in 100 year design events, plus an appropriate allowance for climate change. That would then be discharged at an agreed rate. Most developers would look to discharge at what's termed the greenfield rate. So that's mimicking the pre-development assumed grassed vegetated state of the site.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, I will talk about this a bit later on in the presentation, more detail. For now, we have one last question from Carl. Are there specific distances set for proximity where a Zone 1 site needs to consider climate risk in proximity to Zone 2 and 3 areas?
There's no specific hard and fast rule. What I would say is most sites that are located in Flood Zone 1 and beyond, say, the Flood Zone 2, which is 1 in 1,000 year event, most likely going to be reasonably okay and acceptable and wouldn't have to undertake that climate change analysis. There may be instances where the Environment Agency or local lead flood authority have historical information which would indicate, or alternatively have been supplied with models for other sites, which is indicated that there is a greater risk or likelihood of water to span out a greater area than would normally be assumed. So I would suggest that it's worthwhile on applications open up consultation with the local EA officer in order to establish if there are any specific requirements for your application, should it be in very close proximity to a flood extent. Alternatively, in some cases, there are ordinary water courses, so some water features which cover an area less than 3 kilometers squared, whereby no hydraulic modeling or flood information is readily available, as that site wasn't assessed as part of the wider catchment analysis undertaken by the EA some years ago. And they may, if you have a watercourse passing through your site, ask that you assess the risk from your development to that ordinary watercourse, or whether that ordinary watercourse would pose a flood risk to your development.
Thank you, Jonathan. No more questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, move on to the mitigation. So the usual design standard for developments in England is a 1 in 100 year plus an appropriate allowance for climate change. This is for areas or developments located within a fluvial flood risk. Where a development is located on a coastal location, that design level is 1 in 200 year plus an appropriate allowance for climate change. The example we've extracted here is the red line boundary, and as you can see, the site is located primarily in flood zone 2. That's flood risk up to 1 in 1,000 year, with a small section along that northeast corner shown to be in flood zone 3, and that's events up to or greater of 1 in 100 year event chance reoccurrence. So, in order to fully assess the risk to this particular site, RPS prepared a bespoke hydrological model. This looked at the 1 in 100 year plus climate change allowance flood extents. As can be evidenced by the outputs from this model, you can see that the flood extents associated with that 1 in 100 year plus climate change event are more extensive than the flood zone 3 extents shown on the EA's flood zone maps. From that model, we then extracted the likely flood levels from which appropriate flood resilience and resistance measures could be discussed with the client architect and project team. There are other considerations of flood mitigation as well. As we can see from this is a EA's flood zone map for planning extract taken for Hull, which shows that the area in question is shown to be in flood zone 3. However, the striping patch on the plan also indicates that the area in question benefits from flood defences. As a consequence of that, we look to assess then the residual risk to the area. This is thereby taken into account of as either a breach in the existing flood defences or alternatively an overtopping of the flood defences. We then assume that the greatest risk would be, we would then look at the greatest risk posed to the site either via a breach or overtopping, and then look to put forward appropriate mitigation measures via flood resilience or resistance in order that the site is deemed to be safe based on its vulnerability and operational life. Key flood mitigation requirements for developments. So the first one is flood resilience. Can we make a site safe from development? From flood risk. The first option be, can we raise the floor level or the development significantly enough in order that it is at least 300 mils above the predicted or modelled flood level plus the appropriate allowance for climate change. That is the first point of call. Can we raise the site out of that risk area? Then, if we're able to do that, do we, as a consequence of that raise, have to provide a level of floodplain compensation? This should be either level for level and equivalent to the area of floodplain lost as a consequence of that development being elevated. Sometimes in very restricted site areas, this can be very problematic and unable and very challenging to achieve. We then have to look at bespoke, innovative solutions for which we can achieve that level for level floodplain compensation. Another consideration is the ability to have safe access and egress from the site. Do we have routes available that are very low hazard? Would they cause a risk to disabled people? Or alternatively, is there an option to construct or incorporate into the design a safe refuge for people on the upper floors? On occasion, we need to have a detailed review of the time step associated with a flood event in order that any residents, say for residential development, aren't isolated or has a greater risk for a long period of time, and also what is the flood depth, and should the emergency facilities or services have the ability to access the site should there be a significant issue or human emergency. Another consideration to be taken into account is watercourse easements. As part of any development, you should be aware that you would require a what's termed flood risk activities permit for any developments located within 8 meters of the top of the bank of a watercourse, or alternatively, within 60 meters of a tidal flood defense. This is where the EA want to ensure that they would have ready access to any of their defenses or watercourses in order for maintenance, and to ensure they can move any debris. If there's a flood event, they can get in and they can have access. So that's why they need to ensure that any application within that 8 meters actually goes through that FRAP or land drainage consent application. Another consideration that has come to the forefront recently, and we've seen very significant scrutiny on, has been the sequential test. So, as I say, we have seen that the application of the sequential test element of the flood risk assessment has been more robust over the last couple of years. We've also seen applications being called in for judicial review based on inappropriate application of the sequential test. This, as a consequence, has led to significant program delays and sometimes impacted on the layout should the client see that should it be deemed that the application hasn't applied an appropriate sequential approach. The sequential test is a planning tool which looks to steer developments to areas of lowest flood risk. Historically, planning authorities have focused on fluvial and tidal flooding as the main drivers. However, following a strengthening of the MPPF, all forms of flooding should be considered, focusing not only on fluvial and tidal, but surface water and groundwater risk as well. The sequential test looks to identify all reasonably available sites within a defined search area. This search area should be established by consultation with a local planning officer, taking into consideration the development type, also additional local factors such as transport links and catchments. As I say, this is very dependent on the type of application you are looking at. So a retail development may need to take into account the retail catchment area for which they need to look at and focus on. The undertaking of the sequential test can take a reasonable period of time and dependent on the number of what's termed reasonably available sites there are, which would need to be assessed. Where there is a potential risk that a sequential test is required, it would be beneficial at an early stage to discuss this with your planner or other team members or project members in order that the best approach can be established. Residential sequential tests often require consideration of alternative sites on a borough-wide scale, and this can be tricky to pass if there are other available sites in a lower form or lower category of flood risk. Commercial sequential tests tend to have a reduced search area based on as I say, the nature of development. So at this point, I'll just look through a few case studies. Excuse me. So the case study on screen is one we looked at earlier. It's shown to be in present day flood zone 2 and 3. It's part of the site located in flood zone 3. We've then undertaken a hydraulic model to assess climate change impacts, which has shown that actually that impact is more extensive than the flood zones would indicate, with a flood level established of about 9.07 meters AOD. We then look to locate the residential uses, those more vulnerable uses, 300 millimeters above that level. So that would be at 9.37 meters AOD. And there was no increase in footprint. There was no increase in historical. So as there was development already on the site, there was no increase in the development footprint, excuse me. And therefore, we did not have to provide any compensatory storage for loss of floodplain. As we mentioned earlier, there are hazard maps. So from the hydraulic model that we prepared, we were able to create or generate some hazard mapping, which showed that there was available site access and egress along the southern boundary of the site, and that was through Wimbledon Park Primary School to Wellington Road. This was then this project and approach was accepted by the EA, and the application was progressed and later constructed. So I will just pass over now to my colleague Francesca, who will, sorry, first of all, were there any further questions? I do apologize, yes, Francesca.
That's all right. Thank you, Jonathan. Before I go on and speak about sustainable drainage systems, we have one more question on your first section of the presentation. There's a question about the step back from the watercourse. So the 8 meter step back from a watercourse, how is the top of the back determined? How does this work with culverting?
Culverting, okay. So if you are looking to do a culvert, you would definitely require, if it's on what's termed a main river, that falls under the jurisdiction of the EA, that would be then progressed by a flood risk activities permit. If you are looking to culvert an ordinary watercourse, that would be via the Land Drainage Act, and that would be a consent. So as it would be a culvert, that would be a direct interaction with the given watercourse and therefore subject to the consent. The top of watercourse is normally viewed as the top of bank, which is normally viewed as pretty much the top level, the crest level of the river channel itself, and that would be either side. So it'd be 8 meters from that crest level of the bank. But I would suggest that if you are looking to culvert a watercourse, that you do progress with that FRAP or consent, because it is very complex and actually you are unable to seek retrospective consent for a culvert or culverting of a watercourse, and you should seek that. Otherwise, in some terms, it can be deemed a criminal act to culvert a watercourse without the appropriate consents. So I would, in that case, I would strongly advise that you get the appropriate permits.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. This section, I will be talking about a sustainable urban drainage system, and we encourage everyone to just post their questions in the Q&A box, and I will answer to this later after the presentation. Next slide, please, Jonathan. So why are SuDS important and should be taken into consideration at early stages of the planning process? Because increased air standing, especially in urbanized area from development, can cause rainwater to run off-site more quickly, and also basically higher standing collects water in a different way, which may accumulate in different places, and it's very important to take this into consideration at early stages in any development. So preventing negative impacts from water surface runoff should be taken into consideration in the planning process. Also because sewer networks in urbanized areas are old and they are usually built to the 1 in 30 year standard, while now we need to look at the 1 in 100 plus climate change standard, and therefore sewers cannot hold all the increased runoff from new impermeable areas. So there are 3 pillars for SuDS, which include water quality, water quantity, and also amenity and biodiversity, and we will talk about this in the next slides. So the next slide, please, Jonathan. Thank you. So the lead local flood authority is responsible for surface water drainage for any planning application, and they will comment on the drainage strategy for your development. The PPPG has developed a hierarchy to follow in order to dispose surface water runoff from new developments. The most preferable option is infiltration, because using infiltration measures at your site will help manage runoff very close to its source and alleviate the drainage system of the surrounding area. Should infiltration not be feasible due, for example, of space constraints or underlying geology, there are sites and geology which allow for poor infiltration potential at the site, then the next preferable option is to discharge to a surface water body at a controlled rate. So it's very important when you look at the drainage strategy of your site to see first if infiltration is feasible, and then as a second option if there is a surface water course or water body in the vicinity of your site. Should none of these options work because of constraints of your site, then the last resort would be to discharge to a surface water sewer, highway drain, or to a combined sewer. Thank you, Jonathan. Next slide. When is a surface water drainage system required for a development? So mainly it's required for all major developments. Major developments are classified as being 10 dwellings or more for residential developments, or commercial developments with floor space greater than 1,000 square meters, or for any development which happened on core in a site greater than 1 hectare. And the submission of a surface water drainage strategy is a validation requirement for a planning application for a major development. However, given the increase in climate change impacts in urbanized areas, many LLFA lead local flood authorities are starting to request surface water drainage strategy to be applied also in to non-major development, especially in surface water flood risk areas. So areas which are seen as being at highly risk of surface water, as we can see in the bottom picture of the slide. Thank you, Jonathan. So what are the requirements for this drainage strategy from the LLFA? They require development to incorporate SuDS as much as possible, and unless it's demonstrable that these are unfeasible. Mostly local flood authorities require runoff to be restricted at greenfield rates, which means the rates of existing pre-development scenarios. When a site cannot rely on SuDS or cannot achieve greenfield runoff rates, some local flood authorities may request a reduction in the rates to a minimum of 50% of the existing rates. The LLFA requirements vary depending on district and councils, and however, they all require to submit calculation to include climate change allowance as a factor to take into account the future peaks of precipitation requirements. And we will be looking at how to apply climate change allowance for surface water drainage strategy in the next slide. Additionally, a drainage strategy should include as well a maintenance schedule for all measures proposed in the lifetime of the development. As well, sometimes the LLFA may also require proof of funding for this maintenance schedule over the lifetime of the development. So how do we consider climate change in a surface water drainage strategy? Climate change allowances can be applied as part of the surface water calculations, depending on location, lifetime of the development, and type of the development, as Jonathan already explained for fluvial climate change allowances. But in this case, we are increasing the peak rainfall intensity and therefore calculating how climate change will impact on surface water runoff in the future. And this climate change can be assessed in different scenarios. We have the central scenario, the upper end scenario, and that will depend on the type of development. For example, for less vulnerable development with a lifetime up to 2060, we can use the central allowance, while for highly vulnerable developments with a lifetime beyond 2100, we'll have to look at the upper end, which is almost double the amount of the central allowance. And all these climate change allowance depend on the management catchment. And here we have an example of the London managed catchment and how climate change allowances change depending on the lifetime of the development. So how do the local plan policy consider SuDS, and how do the LLFA want us to consider these into our development? We have already explained a bit about the drainage hierarchy, which consider infiltration as first option to discharge of surface water from the site. However, lately, rainwater harvesting is being pushed by many LLFA and local planning authorities as the most sustainable in the drainage hierarchy. This is because it involves reuse of rainwater for useful purposes on a site, which could involve, for example, water for washing machine, flushing toilets, or irrigation for new planting. After rainwater use, the most sustainable is also infiltration, as already discussed, and then discharge into surface water course or into the sewer as last option. Thank you, Jonathan. So I'll talk about just a case study to understand the constraint that an urbanized development can have. And because as anticipated, we've discussed that urbanized areas are far more challenging. There are a lot of constraints on urban sites, and this can include the size, the location of the sewer, the nearest sewer, the geology at the site itself. So for this site, we can see that the majority of the site is occupied by the building footprint. There is not very much space for open water features such as ponds and swales because of space constraints. And as well, infiltration testing has come out negative in terms that the potential of infiltration to the ground is not feasible. There are no surface water courses. So we have gone all the way down drainage hierarchy. And the last possible option here is to discharge to a public surface water sewer. The discharge to a public surface water sewer, however, cannot happen, will not be agreed if we do not restrict the flow from the site. And as we discussed, we try to restrict the flow from this site to greenfield runoff rates, which are the rates pre-development. So if we imagine that this site was not developed, we can calculate what the greenfield runoff rates would be and use this as a restricted rate to the sewer. In order to do this and restrict the rates, however, we need to implement some measures. In this case, we also followed the drainage hierarchy and we looked at the options. And the first option we implemented was a green roof. So that could attenuate and also slow down the runoff at the site. And then in order to reach the requirements of attenuation at the site, we implemented permeable paving, which was lined with an impermeable surface, therefore acting as attenuation only and not infiltrating into the ground, in combination with two underground geocellular storage crate system, which in combination with the permeable paving will then attenuate the water and discharge at a controlled rate into the surface water system. We've talked about mainly water quantity so far. So how can we attenuate this water and dispose it as close as possible to its source? But SuDS provide way wider benefits behind attenuation. We have water reuse, which already discussed, and then water quality, as well as many SuDS measures such as for example, swales, ponds, and permeable paving, which allow infiltration to the ground as very good water quality implications. They also provide amenity and biodiversity within a site. They contribute to the reduction of urban heat island effect in a city, and even contribute to make a development nutrient neutral. This concept of nutrient neutrality has been quite popular in the UK lately, and I'm going to explain why and what that nutrient neutrality means. This is the last topic of the day, and we will talk about how a development can achieve nutrient neutrality. So what is nutrient neutrality? There are a lot of nutrients moving through our natural environment. There are two main dominant compounds, which are phosphorus and nitrogen. They're very different in how they work, and they function and interact, but they work in tandem to facilitate growth. However, the presence of phosphorus and nitrogen in the environment is really good, but when too much nutrients can happen in one specific system, then this can cause the explosion of growth of plant lift, as we can see in the picture on the slide, which is best known as green algae. And this can be very damaging for habitats. So excess of nutrients is causing eutrophication, damaging sensitive habitats across the UK. But nutrient overload is nothing new, really. However, lately it's causing major problems for natural England, who is charged with managing the most sensitive habitats in the UK. It's difficult to protect the sites and these very sensible habitats due to the cumulative impacts of many small pollutants from many sources. So what are these sources? We can have pollutants from urban areas, for example, foul discharges from residential developments, farming, and surface water as well, due to erosion of, for example, soil and rock. Every contribution, even if small, counts towards the budget of nutrients into one ecosystem. So there were some changes in 2018 following the Dutch nitrogen case, and there are now opportunities to manage the release of nutrients from new development, and therefore nutrient neutrality was born. In the UK, 42 councils were found to have sensitive sites, which meant that they have to consider nutrient neutrality in their planning process. These 42 sites include source protection areas, special areas of conservation, sites designed under the Ramsar Convention, and also sites identified required as compensatory measures for adverse effect on the above sites. Thank you, Jonathan. So how do we reach nutrient neutrality? Natural England has issued a guidance for every local authority. And there's guidance related to planning in nutrient impacts. And these were identified as resulting from changes in land use, roads, parking areas, garden, and so on. The increase from waste generated from the development, mainly sewage as well. And they've developed the guidance looking at how developments layout and population growth work together in order to not increase nutrient loading in these sensitive areas. But next slide, please. How do we demonstrate that our development is nutrient neutral? Natural England has developed some very high-level budget calculators, which calculate if mitigation for a proposed development is required. And Natural England has as well issued some funds to help local authority to refine these calculators and tailor them to the single catchments. So the impact, just briefly how this calculator works, the impact of a new development is assessed in 4 stages. The first stage is calculating the indirect loading, so from the sewage. The second is to calculate the nutrient loading from the current land use, and the third stage is from the future land use. And then stage 4 is the difference between the two and need for and then it will tell you if it needs external mitigation to be applied for your development. But given that these nutrient calculators are very generalized and they're not very catchment specific, Natural England applies a precautionary buffer of 20%, and therefore the nutrient load is multiplied by 1.2, and we have a 20% more nutrient budget to offset. Different land uses have different loading. For example, farming has a very high load in nutrients, and because this Natural England calculator use generic data, there is opportunity to use site-specific data evidence to support your planning application within a specific catchment. Over and above the planning guidance being developed by the local authorities and Natural England, there is also some design guidance now. For example, Syria published a guidance that describes how SuDS can actually help combat nutrient neutrality and how SuDS can reduce phosphorus in surface water runoff. This focuses on phosphorus and how it's transported, sorry, and it gives advice primarily on how to reduce loading from your site runoff. And this is a really helpful guidance that developers can use to understand how to reduce phosphorus loading from their site. In terms of mitigation, we have found out that in most cases, the application of the generic nutrient neutrality calculator results in the need of providing additional mitigation. So what are the obvious next steps? The first step would be to move the sewage waste outside of the catchment boundary. This will help alleviate a lot nutrient budget of a specific habitat. Then we have other options such as land improvement, land use change, and wetland creation, because wetlands can have a huge positive impact on reducing nutrients being transported to a specific vulnerable site. And a consideration of these options up front is really important, because they need to be considered as part of the wider master plan or the planning development, the proposed development plan, because without the we need to take nutrient neutrality into account if a proposed development sits within one of these very sensible areas, and mitigation must be proposed as part of the planning application. And lately, also with some council, we are looking to implement some nutrient credit schemes, which could be offsetting nutrient loads in other sites, so away from your development, but still contributing to the overall health of a certain ecosystem. So the top tips for nutrient neutrality and for SuDS as well are to start the assessment process early, check groundwater catchments for your site, think about holistic solutions, and make space for water, and consider if your nutrient neutrality solution needs any environmental permits, because these take time and it's always worth taking this into account in early stages of the planning process.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Thank you all for attending. I hope you found it all very useful and informative.